There was a hidden quarry pond surrounded by limestone cliffs where my brother Liam and I used to spend our weekends. We would pack up simple cane poles, drop in waxworms, and pull out dozens of rock bass. Those quiet afternoons are the exact reason I became obsessed with angling. The quarry wasn't a popular spot, despite being teeming with fish. Local fishermen avoided it because reaching it required a brutal 2-mile trek through a dense briar thicket, a hurdle that Liam and I gladly accepted. That total isolation was the best part. It felt like we possessed a secret world that belonged only to us. Any seasoned angler knows that predatory fish feed heavily during the twilight hours. While most people prefer the pre-dawn mist, my brother and I fell into a routine of hiking out late and staying deep into the midnight hours. It became our escape from the usual small-town high school parties. It was a crisp autumn Friday when everything went south. We reached the limestone ledger just as the amber sun dipped below the tree line. By the time our lines were cast, total darkness had set in. We sat on a flat shelf of stone that perfectly held our tackle boxes and lanterns, a routine we had executed hundreds of times. As we waited for a strike, a strange ripple caught my eye near the shadowed northern bank. The displacement of water was massive, and I was shocked I hadn't heard it sooner. I nudged Liam, and the two of us squinted into the gloom, trying to decipher the silhouette. The quarry was wide, and with the fog rolling in, visibility was terrible. Then the water fractured. A massive pale shape began to break the surface where the ripples had centered. My initial thought of a record-breaking sturgeon instantly vanished. It wasn't a fish. It was far too tall, rising vertically out of the depths. Liam gasped out a curse at the exact moment the realization hit me. It was a human being. The sheer wrongness of the sight hit like ice water. Not only was someone out here in a restricted quarry past midnight, but they had been fully submerged beneath the black water for the entire hour we'd been sitting there. If they had breathed, we would have seen the bubbles. The absolute impossibility of it set my pulse racing, and every survival instinct told me to run. Liam, however, froze, arguing that the swimmer was hundreds of yards away and couldn't bother us. We sat trapped in a trance, watching the figure. It began to sway side to side in a rhythmic, mechanical motion. The movements weren't the frantic splashes of someone drowning. They were terrifyingly smooth, as if the entity was completely synchronous with the freezing water. Our fishing rods lay forgotten on the rock as we stared. Liam whispered that maybe it was a diver checking underwater valves, but I reached down and touched the surface of the quarry. The water was near freezing. No human could survive in it without a thick neoprene dry suit. Yet this figure was completely bare-shouldered. I tried to shake off the dread and told Liam we needed to pack up. When I looked at him, his face was bloodless. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide and completely vacant, staring right at the swaying shape. He had dropped his rod entirely. I snapped his name 3 times before he blinked, shaking his head as if waking from hypnosis. He muttered an apology, picked up his rod and tried to cast, but our nerves were shot. A few minutes later, Liam gripped my forearm. "Look," he whispered. I looked across the expanse just in time to see the figure slide backward into the glassy water without making a single splash. It disappeared completely. We stared at the empty space, waiting for a head to pop up. Liam pulled out his watch to time it. When the digital timer passed the 4-minute mark, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the woods. Nobody holds their breath that long in freezing water while moving. I didn't care what Liam wanted anymore. I began throwing our gear into our backpacks. Liam begged me to wait just a little longer to see when they would come up. I kept packing, the primal urge to flee screaming in my chest. Right at the 5-minute mark, the water broke again. Except this time, the ripples were barely 30 yards away from our limestone shelf. The entity hadn't just stayed underwater, it had traveled the length of a football field toward us in total darkness. Liam finally panicked. We stood up to bolt, but our eyes locked onto the figure rising from the shallows. Through the moonlight, I realized it was a young woman. She had sodden raven hair plastered to her face, wearing a simple dark sundress. And worst of all, she looked entirely ordinary, even beautiful. She looked no older than 20. Seeing a normal human face instantly disarmed my terror, making me wonder if we were overreacting to a local eccentric. She broke the silence, offering a sweet melodic, "Hello." Her tone was playful, completely ignoring the fact that she had just survived a 5-minute underwater sprint through freezing currents. She floated effortlessly, bobbing in the water like a cork. Liam, voice trembling, asked what she was doing out here. She tilted her head back, laughing softly, and said she was just enjoying the evening. When Liam asked if she was cold, she smiled widely, revealing teeth that looked just a bit too sharp in the moonlight. She glided 5 feet closer. "Come in," she whispered. "The water is perfect." The sheer insanity of the invitation snapped me out of it. I felt an overwhelming wave of malice radiating from her icy stare. I grabbed Liam's jacket, yelled, "We're leaving!" and turned my back on her. I expected her to mock us, but instead an inhuman shriek ripped through the night. "No!" she bellowed, a sound so loud it vibrated in my teeth. We dropped half our tackle and sprinted up the steep dirt trail. Behind us, the woman didn't stop. She began to wail a wordless, agonizing screech that sounded like an animal being torn apart. We could still hear the shrieking echoing through the trees when we reached the truck a mile away. Liam immediately dialed the sheriff, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the phone. He reported a distraught swimmer at the quarry, but refused to stay at the scene when the dispatcher asked, shifting the truck into drive and tearing down the gravel road. We avoided the quarry for months. When we finally returned next summer, we brought our uncle, an avid hunter who carried a sidearm. He wanted to see the place for himself, but the water remained completely still. We never saw her again. For years, Liam and I treated it as a bizarre campfire story, joking about the quarry witch to mask our lingering fear. But now that I am older, the true horror of that night weighs on me. She wasn't a swimmer, and she wasn't just mentally ill. No human being moves like that under ice-cold water. My name is Marcus, and the water is my sanctuary. Give me a rod and a reel, and I'm content, whether I'm tracking trout in streams or navigating the deep tidal creeks here in the coastal lowlands of Georgia. This nightmare took place last April, out on the brackish backwaters with my lifelong fishing partner, Mateo. We were targeting redfish in a labyrinth of tidal creeks, a maze we'd paddled dozens of times. The Georgia salt marshes are shallow and notoriously unforgiving, so we loaded up my heavy-duty tandem kayak. It was early spring, meaning the air carried a sharp chill, and the plash of the marsh water against the hull was freezing. After paddling for about 2 miles into the tall marsh grass, we found a deep bend that looked perfect. The marsh was dead silent. There wasn't another soul out there, which was exactly the kind of solitude we chased. We cracked open a thermos of coffee and cast our lines into the stillness. An hour passed before Mateo's line went taut. Something heavy was pulling hard. In his excitement to net the fish, Mateo leaned dangerously far over the gunwale of the kayak. I saw the disaster unfolding a microsecond before it happened. As he tilted, his brand new smartphone slipped from his chest pocket and vanished into the gray, opaque water. Mateo was furious. He kept repeating that his insurance would replace a broken phone, but not one sitting at the bottom of a swamp. He couldn't afford a replacement, and honestly, neither could I. I agreed to help him look. Even though the marsh water was thick with suspended sediment, you couldn't see past your own wrist. We spent 20 minutes drifting in circles, using the blades of our paddles to scrape the bottom, hoping to hit something metallic. It was useless. The floor of the creek was a shifting soup of dead vegetation and deep, pliant mud. We quickly lost track of the exact spot where it fell. I told Mateo it was gone and we should just enjoy the day, but he refused to give up. Before I could argue, Mateo stripped down to his boxers. He announced he was going overboard to walk the creek bed and feel for the device with his bare feet. It wasn't the worst plan, considering the paddles were useless. The moment his feet touched the sludge, he let out a sharp gasp from the thermal shock. The water came all the way up to his chest, nearly 5 feet deep, but his stubbornness won out. He began shuffling through the muck, sweeping his feet back and forth. I watched anxiously from the kayak. The cold was brutal, and I knew hypothermia would set in if he stayed under much longer. I kept praying he'd either hit the phone or just give up. Then Mateo's face contorted in pure shock. His torso violently jerked forward. One second he was standing steady, and the next he was violently sucked straight down beneath the surface. My first thought was that he had stepped into a sudden drop-off or stumbled over a submerged log. But 5 seconds passed, then 10, and the water above him remained completely still. No bubbles, no splashing. Panic overtook me. I tore off my boots and heavy coat, preparing to dive into the freezing marsh to drag him out. Suddenly, Mateo erupted from the water. He was choked with black mud, his eyes wide with a primal terror I had never seen in another human being. "Paddle, go! Get us out of here!" he screamed frantically, scrambling into the kayak with manic strength. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed the paddle and dug into the water, propelling us away from the bend as fast as my shoulders allowed. Mateo was shivering uncontrollably, staring back at the ripples in the creek as if a monster was about to break the surface behind us. Once we reached the main river channel, I stopped paddling. What happened down there? Mateo pressed his hands against his face to stop the shaking. He explained that as he was clearing a patch of weeds with his foot, something had clamped onto his left ankle and violently dragged him downward. He struggled to find the words to describe it. He said it wasn't the jaws of an alligator or the smooth skin of a giant catfish. It felt like a cluster of cold, muscular appendages that wrapped tightly around his bone with immense pressure. He claimed that once he was dragged to the bottom, the thing tried to pull him horizontally into a submerged cavern beneath the marsh grass. He had to kick repeatedly with his free leg, striking the mass until it finally released its grip, allowing him to break for the surface. We loaded the kayak onto the truck in absolute silence. Mateo didn't say a single word the entire drive home. I tried to rationalize it, suggesting it was a massive snapping turtle or a stray bull shark, but I wasn't the one who felt the grip. Mateo knew the local wildlife, and he swore this was something else entirely. I still fish those coastal marshes, but the joy's gone. Every time the water turns murky or a stray piece of seaweed brushes against my kayak, a cold spike of dread hits my stomach. Something lives in the deep mud of those backwaters, and it isn't looking for bait. This event took place last summer, and it still keeps me awake on quiet nights. It involved my usual weekend crew, Elijah, Maya, Chloe, and myself. We were looking for a place to hang out on a warm Saturday evening when Elijah suggested an old county reservoir located just past Chloe's neighborhood. Elijah and I were avid bass fishermen and knew the reservoir held some massive largemouths, so we brought our gear. Maya and Chloe were just looking forward to sitting by the water, sharing a six-pack, and maybe waiting if the night stayed warm. The reservoir sat deep in the forestry area, requiring a 10-minute drive down. Dirt roads and a brief trek through a broken chain-link fence marked with faded "No Trespassing" signs. The fence had a massive tear in it that looked years old, which we always joked was our private portal to a hidden paradise. The reservoir was beautiful, a dark basin of clear water hemmed in by ancient pines. On the southern bank sat a small patch of gravelly sand we nicknamed the Ridge. It was completely isolated, meaning we could play music and talk as loudly as we wanted without anyone bothering us. The twilight was fading when we slipped through the wire. Elijah and I immediately began assembling our spinning rods, while the girls laid out a blanket and opened some drinks. The atmosphere was perfect. As the girls were discussing whether the water was warm enough for a swim, Maya stopped mid-sentence. She pointed toward a thick cluster of cattails 50 yards down the bank. "Is that a boat?" We all looked. Embedded deeply in the reeds was a weathered aluminum canoe. It was resting at a bizarre angle, floating freely as if it had recently drifted into the weeds rather than being intentionally moored. We had frequented this reservoir for over a year and had never seen another vessel out here. Driven by curiosity, Elijah and I decided to walk down the shoreline to inspect it, while the girls stayed on the blanket with the music playing. The walk took only a few minutes, but as we drew close, a heavy feeling of unease settled over me. The canoe wasn't abandoned junk. It was loaded with active gear. An expensive graphite fishing rod was resting against the gunnel, its monofilament line trailing directly down into the deep water. An open tackle box sat on the center seat. its lures scattered as if someone had been interrupted while picking a bait. Even weirder, a half-eaten apple and a fresh bottle of water sat in the bow. But the centerpiece of the scene was a smartphone lying face up on the bench. The screen was locked, but the built-in flashlight was turned on, casting a stark beam against the aluminum hull. I looked at Elijah. Who walks away from their phone with the light running? Elijah didn't answer. His face had gone serious. A fisherman might leave his tackle if he stepped into the woods to relieve himself, but no one leaves a live line in the water, a fresh meal, and a glowing phone. It looked like the occupant had vanished into thin air just moments before we arrived. We scanned the tree line and shouted into the woods, but only the wind answered. We hurried back to the girls and explained what we saw. The details of the canoe cast an immediate chill over our party. I kept looking back toward the reeds, watching the aluminum boat rock slowly in the dark water, feeling a terrible sense of impending doom. Chloe insisted that we pack up and leave right then, and I didn't argue. The fun was gone. As we began gathering our backpacks, Chloe gasped, her finger pointing across the wide expanse of the reservoir. On the exact opposite shore, a figure was standing waist-deep in the water. Even in the dying light, the silhouette was unmistakable. They were holding a long, straight object, either a massive branch or a thick gaff. But the terrifying part was their posture. They were completely motionless, staring directly across the water at our campfire. They had been watching us in total silence. The mystery of the canoe instantly transformed into raw, visceral terror. We all knew we were in danger. We grabbed our gear and began a fast, panicked march back toward the fence line. That's when the silence broke. A gravelly, furious voice roared across the water. "You don't belong here! Get out!" the man screamed, his voice dripping with an unstable, manic rage. He kept cursing, his shouts echoing off the pine trees like a madman. I turned my head back for a split second and my heart dropped. The man dropped his staff, plunged forward, and threw his torso into the deep water. He was swimming directly toward us, cutting through the reservoir with terrifying speed. "Run!" I screamed. We sprinted through the dark woods, branches tearing at our clothes. We reached the chain-link fence and scrambled through the tear as fast as humanly possible. Being the last in line, I could hear the heavy, rhythmic slapping of water behind me as the swimmer neared our side of the bank. We dove into the car, locked the doors, and Elijah threw the vehicle into reverse, spraying gravel as we tore down the road. We parked in a well-lit grocery store lot 20 minutes later, trying to process the madness. Maya was sobbing, and Elijah was trying to comfort her, but his own hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Who was that man? Was he the owner of the canoe? Or had he done something to the person who actually belonged in that boat? The thought that we might have interrupted a crime scene made my stomach turn. Chloe wanted to call the state police, but we ultimately decided against it. We were trespassing on restricted county property, and we had no real information other than a man shouting at us to leave. It's been a year since that night, and none of us have ever spoken of returning to the reservoir. The girls refused to even drive past the access road. I still wonder what the police would have found if they dragged that dark water, but some secrets are better left undisturbed in the dark.